I did not fully understand why her name carried so much tension. I remember the whispers, the criticism, especially in her work, and how some people spoke about her with admiration in certain circles, and with others, there was a sense of suspicion in the air. We are represented. We are represented. We are represented. Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started. From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. Welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. I'm so happy you're tuned in. A couple of episodes ago, episode 93 on dehumanizing language has been such a huge hit. Thank you. And I've gotten lots of feedback from that episode, which lets me know and actually confirms the overwhelm we are feeling as a collective during these what I'm calling morally decaying times, especially how corrupt power can be in the wrong hands. And we're seeing that in real time. I know you're possibly experiencing a particular kind of uncertainty in the air right now. And I do not say that to be dramatic. It is true. It is simply what I am observing when I pay attention across the news cycle, across social media, across the way institutions are behaving, because that's very telling, and across the way people are speaking to one another. The tone is different. It's heightened. And even within my own group program, we gathered last week as a cohort that came together. Alumni from my program represented. It's a membership. And the feelings that were echoed around the virtual room was it's a time of overwhelm. And power feels more concentrated right now and less accountable. Public language, as I was alluding to a little bit earlier, it feels harsher. It really does. In fact, I would go as far as saying the harshest I've observed it to be in the online space for me personally, and more permissible in its cruelty. The envelope just seems to be pushed more and more further. Moral compromise feels normalized, sometimes even rewarded. And when institutions wobble, they're not wobbling behind closed doors, the cracks. They're showing up and they're showing us who is protected, who is dismissed, who is believed, and whose dignity is treated as, oh, you know what, this is negotiable. And it's in moments like this, the question that keeps returning for me is not only what do we do, and honestly, is there anything that we can do, but how do we learn to see clearly? Like really discern, especially when there is noise everywhere. Uncertainty feels hard to grasp. It feels hard to come by. How can we have our eyes open and not question, is this really happening? And feeling like there's some kind of insanity. How can we, in these times, begin to see clearly? And the key word for me here is discern the times we're in. I've been asking myself, when power begins to shift in destabilizing ways, who has navigated this terrain before? And I keep coming back to those who have experienced trauma, been marginalized, those who have a lived experience with navigating power that doesn't favor them. I keep thinking in particular of Black women and how perhaps in this season of uncertainty and unstable ground, they might just be the ones to help us navigate through these times and build our capacity for this moment. Let me tell you a story of a woman who changed the hearts and moral compass of our people where I grew up. And she ended up with a Nobel Peace Prize, although that wasn't her intention. I grew up in Kenya, and as a young girl, I remember hearing the name Wangari Maathai. In fact, she came from the same location, Teto, in Nyeri County, where my parents grew up. And so she was commonly referred to as Wangari. At the time, I did not fully understand why her name carried so much tension. I remember the whispers, the criticism, especially in her work, and how some people spoke about her with admiration in certain circles, and with others, there was a sense of suspicion in the air. I remember hearing about arrests and even watching it on TV and backlash, and even without understanding the full political context, I could sense that she was doing something that unsettled people. And the people who are unsettled were the people who were used to power going unchallenged. What I remember most clearly is the image of women gathering to plant trees, hands in soil, seedlings being placed in the earth, with a kind of patience that could easily be mistaken for softness if you did not understand what it meant. But honestly, there was nothing soft about it. It was organized, it was persistent and communal. The state did not treat it as ordinary. It was treated as a threat. The women were framed as agitators, troublemakers, and people stepping out of place. It wasn't just the protection of the environment that Wagari was campaigning about. It was also about demanding the release of political prisoners that had been arrested by the government at the time. I distinctly remember Wagari and the women being confronted by the police, and the women stood their ground. In fact, they stripped naked. Now, in many African communities, there is no stronger curse or taboo upon men seeing their mothers naked. Wagari was beaten unconscious and hospitalized. Now, eventually, they won their plea. But I have to tell you, that image has stayed with me for decades because it carries such a raw truth. And as a child, I just feel like it was seared in my memory. Looking back now, I'm seeing it differently with a little bit more understanding. Tree planting as resistance, community, I'm seeing it as the infrastructure that Wagari used because the gathering itself mattered as much as the trees did. I'm also seeing the correlation here with planting, which is slow by design. And slow work has a way of outlasting systems that depend on fear and urgency. Wagari understood that environmental degradation was inseparable from political corruption, and that land, dignity, and power are always connected. And I think what's important to mention here is that she was reading patterns. She was paying attention to what many people would rather have ignored because it was an inconvenience or because it required a kind of courage they did not feel ready for. And so I did some digging and I realized there is language for what I'm describing here because those who are closest to instability see patterns and they see them early. Patricia Hill Collins writes about the outsider within, the way Black women can be positioned close enough to the center of systems to see how they operate, but not protected enough to trust those systems. That position can produce a particular kind of clarity because it forces you to learn the architecture of power. Get this, in order to survive it. W.E.B. Du Bois described double consciousness, the need to constantly see yourself through your own eyes and also through the eyes of a society that has already assigned you meaning. That ongoing act of translation is absolutely exhausting, but it also cultivates perception. You become aware of how narratives are constructed. You learn what is being signaled underneath what is actually being said. And when we bring in post colonial thought, including the work of Achille Bembe on how power decides who is protected and who is exposed. And we are seeing that right now in the Epstein files. We begin to see that instability is rarely random. It has patterns, targets, it has predictability, predictable outcomes for particular communities, or might I say, particular people. African feminist political thought adds another essential layer because it often understands leadership as relational rather than individualistic, which is what we see a lot from the West. Leadership is not merely who has the microphone, leadership is who is holding the community together. That's why women are so powerful. It's about who is creating safety, who is organizing care, who is telling the truth when the truth is inconvenient, and who is building alternatives when the systems that are meant to be there to protect us fail. This is the key idea I want to unpack and really zero in so you can see it for yourself. Now, if you have grown up inside systems that were never built for you, you do not romanticize them. In other words, by romanticizing, I mean when we see people that we admire who fought hard for freedom, like the Winnie Mandelas, the Rosa Parks, the Harriet Tubmans, who inspire. We're not just inspired, but we study them, we read them carefully, and there's an anticipation that something is about to shift. And it's through that lens of looking at things from that particular way of power and what it does is leadership literacy. It is one reason Black women who have lived close to instability often develop an ability to recognize patterns earlier than others. That ability is not a personality trait. It is a form of social intelligence that's shaped by history and by daily lived navigation. Since doing this podcast and speaking to so many women of color, they have taught me so much. And that is why I find this podcast so powerful to you, the listener, because of the insights it gives. These are women of color whose voices are often left out from mainstream narratives when it comes to matters that question equitable practices. And my own thinking has been shaped in very real ways by the women of color I have been in conversation with. On the podcast and outside of the podcast. I want to go back to some of those moments, some of those key moments, and maybe for you, it might prompt a going back to some of these episodes and digging a little bit deeper and perhaps hearing them differently than you have before because of the current times we're living in. In the moments where I have felt weary, these are the women whose thinking has kind of brought me back to center, kind of grounded me. So when we go back as far as episode number 9 with Elma Acob, God, I love her and what she brought to that episode. It's given me cultural insight and intellectual rigor, particularly in naming how often women are pressured to mold themselves to frameworks that were not created with them in mind. And she put it plainly when she said, and I quote, "We are fitting into something that wasn't created for us or by us." How do you do that? How do you even try and fit into something that wasn't designed for you? Think about an outfit, a dress. If it wasn't made for you, whether it's 10 sizes bigger or 5 sizes smaller, how do you even begin to fit in it? And how do you end up looking in it? It doesn't look right. And then fast forward to episode 40 with the incredible Dr. Kathomi Gatwiri. And she offered political clarity and embodied wisdom, especially in how she described colonization as something we swim in daily, often without realizing how it is shaping our self perception and our understanding of power. She said, "We are all swimming in it every day, collecting colonial messages about who we are and being sold the illusions of those messages as if they were facts about us." And then fast forward to episode 47 with Elizabeth Lang has brought sharp discernment and a deep grounding to her work in human rights. She brings that lens into these conversations. She once reflected on her upbringing and how it shaped the work she does now. And she said, being exposed at that age, and it was an early age, to content around human rights and injustice. She was learning from her father. It had a firm impact on who I am. It's always had a human rights basis to it. So she's kind of qualifying and affirming the work that she does in anti-racism as a strategist. And she offered a thought that is confronting. And especially if you're a white person, you will find this really confronting, precisely because it pulls out of the comfort of thinking about harm only comes in extreme forms. And this is what she said. She said, nice people can be racist too. Now, if you go back to the episode where I was unpacking uh, the difference between being nice and being kind, you'll realize that those two things are very, very different. Really kind of solidifying this statement that nice people can be racist too. And then fast forward just a little bit to episode 48. Nina Duffy. Loved Nina Duffy and her British accent. I absolutely loved having her. She brought a blend of, again, cultural insight and practical wisdom. And what has stayed with me is how clearly she named internalized beliefs that slow women of color down, especially when she named internalized beliefs. that we must endlessly qualify ourselves before we can take up space. She said, and I quote, "How many times have we heard that we need to work 10 times as hard just to get half of the accolades or half the success?" And she reframed underrepresentation in a way that is deeply relevant to leadership. She said, "Just because there are a lot of people that I see who look like me, it doesn't mean that it's not for me, rather than waiting to be invited." This is so powerful. I create my own table. Oh, Nina, that was incredible. And then finally, to a very recent episode, episode 94, Christine Mudavanu has offered both cultural insight and structural vision, particularly when speaking about women of color in leadership and what it means to be the first. And we've spoken about this a lot because women of color often find themselves as the only ones in certain rooms, and many times that means that they are the first ones. And that in itself is carries visibility and a certain kind of expectation. She describes the women she interviewed as women who understand the responsibility that they are carrying because many of them are first in their spaces. And she spoke about identity as something that anchors leadership. Because I know who I am, I know my heritage. Everything is possible for me. When we embrace who we are at our core, that's when our power really erupts. When I speak about learning from Black women in uncertain times, this is what I mean. I mean learning from women who have been reading systems for a long time, women whose thinking has been formed in contexts that require discernment, patience, and clarity. But in saying all this about learning from Black women, I need to mention something really important here. And maybe you've been thinking about it, especially if you're somebody who this work is work that you've been doing for quite some time. Because there's a way people talk about Black women's resilience that can become harmful, even when the intention is praise. Bell Hooks wrote about the way Black women can often uh, be expected to be endlessly strong and how that expectation becomes a form of violence because it denies softness, rest, care, and turns survival into a requirement rather than a response to oppression. So when I talk about learning from Black women, I'm not talking about treating Black women as moral backup plans for a society that's in decline. I'm not talking about outsourcing groundedness to people who have already carried so much. I'm not talking about admiring resilience while ignoring what produced it. What I am talking about is learning from leadership literacy, from that keyword again, discernment, from the frameworks that have been cultivated under pressure, and doing so with respect, with responsibility, and humility. And so I want to bring it back home to us as coaches and space holders. If you have largely operated inside systems that have worked for you, then this season may feel disorienting. You may be watching institutional instability and feeling unsure of what to trust. Maybe you may be noticing as well harsher rhetoric and wondering what it means for how you lead clients, how you hold community, and how you make decisions in your business. Especially if you have never had to question whether institutions will protect you, it can be unsettling to realize a protection in these times is maybe not guaranteed. But there are women who have been reading Instability for generations. The invitation here is not to look to them for inspiration, but rather to pay attention to the frameworks, to study how discernment is formed, to notice how power is read, and how community is built, how truth is spoken without theatrics, and how leadership is practiced in ways that sustain people over a long, long time. And so I want to ask the question, when culture feels unstable, who are you studying? Whose leadership are you observing? Whose resilience has been forged in conditions you have not yet experienced? So here is what I want to leave with you. Audit your intellectual influences. Who is shaping your leadership right now? Are the voices you learn from diverse in lived experience, or are they largely drawn from people whose stability mirrors your own? When the ground shifts, who do you turn to for frameworks and not necessarily comfort? And I also want to add this, especially for those of you who are white business owners listening. The question is not how to replicate Black women's resilience. The question is how to learn from literacy around power, community, and foresight that can be cultivated under pressure. If you are leading a business in unstable times, you need leadership frameworks that are historically informed, culturally aware, and morally grounded. And guess what? That's the work we do inside my program, Represented. Now, if that in any way is tugging on your heart right now, what I've shared today in this episode about learning from Black women and what they have to offer during these unstable times, I want to invite you to join the waitlist for the next round of Represented. And when the doors open, you will be the first to know. And when you go to the link, which is anigishu.com/represented, you'll find out more details about the program. But, my friend, I hope this episode has given you a new kind of hope and allowed you to look at the times we're living in through a different lens. A lens where perhaps those who've historically been excluded have built the muscle to help lead us in this very moment. We are represented. We are represented. We are represented. Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.